Hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 of Module 4. I'll be taking over for Jen at this point and walking us through part 2 and part 3 of this module. Jen has done a really nice, I think, effective job of setting us up for this module as we begin our conversations around what it means to have an evidence-based classroom management structure for all of your students. I'll be walking us through the first pieces of this content, focusing on the setting event and antecedent strategies, and also focusing on what does it look like to physically arrange our environment effectively, plan for routines, and then develop and establish and then teach class-wide expectations. So first, let's walk into part 2. In this part, we're going to look at, to answer the question, how do I maximize structure in my classroom? To answer this question, we'll be using 3 guiding inquiries. The first question is, are the foundations of effective PCBS in place? For those of you who are unaware of this acronym stands for Positive Classroom Behavior Supports. So in this part of this module, we'll be answering the question, do we have the foundations in place to effectively establish and then maintain positive classroom behavior supports? Our second guiding question will be, are proactive and positive PCBS practices implemented consistently? So we'll be talking about how do you collect data, manage that data, and monitor student behavioral progress over time. The third guiding question at the bottom of your screen, do data indicate that students are still engaging in problem behavior? And the follow-up question would, of course, be, what do we do if they are? These are the questions we'll be answering throughout the duration of this module and into upcoming modules. So first, let's take a look at our first leading question. Are the foundations of effective positive classroom behavior support in place? To answer that, we're going to look at 2 different areas of classroom management. First, the physical layout and routines embedded within the structures of your classroom environment. And then second, how do you establish and teach explicit social skills instructions and expectations in your classroom? The first element here is to look at effectively designing the physical arrangement of your classroom. Let's look at what a couple examples may appear as. At the elementary level, have you planned the layout according to the type of activity that you're planning to roll out in your classroom? For example, are tables set up for centers? Are there separate desks for independent work across your lessons? Or is there a circle area for students depending on the structure and the lesson you'll be delivering? At the high school level, the question also would be similar. Have you planned the layout according to the type of activity that you're planning for your students? Does that mean that physically when you walk into your classroom, you might see a U-shape or a circle for discussion-based activities? Are students' desks forward-facing? Or are they facing each other? All depending on the activities of the lesson that you have planned for. A non-example of what putting conscious thought towards the physical layout of your room would be is if you walked into a classroom environment and you noticed that it appeared disorderly. It maybe looks messy, unclean, and or visually unappealing to the learners. Effectively, if you have not thought through what the physical layout of your classroom looks like, you might see this red box showing up around your school. If that is you, the next question becomes, how do you modify or change your classroom environment and the physical space of your environment to best meet your learners' needs? What we want to do is design an environment to A, elicit appropriate behavior from all of your students, that is consistently and across time, and B, minimize crowding and distraction within your physical space. Some ideas behind how you may do this. You may look to rearrange the furniture in your classroom to allow for easy traffic flow. And that's speaking to the traffic flow of your students as they work between routines, as well as the traffic flow of different educators and adults as they come in and out of your learning environment. Second, you might consider the seating arrangements. You have students seated in groups, in pairs, individually, in rows, among other variations. You also want to ensure that you have adequate supervision of all areas. So depending on the context of your environment, you may be the only adult in there. You may also have paraprofessionals coming into your classroom. You may have coaches or interventionists entering into your room, special education teachers, and other folks who might find themselves in your room. Have you set up your physical environment to meet the needs of your learners and to adequately allow for all those activities to be supervised by the adult in the room? Have you also thought through the designated staff and student areas? So again, depending on what you're teaching and what routine you're working through or what lesson you're focusing on, you want to make sure that you have designated physical areas that staff are able to operate within, as well as students. So have you thought through designating staff and student areas in your classroom? In this slide, let's take a look at some examples of physical arrangements for small group instruction. You may reflect on if you have these arrangements in your classroom today. First, you want to see if you have efficient staff and student areas across your routines of your school day. Second, you might look around your room and identify if you have group versus individual workspaces for your students across different activities. You're also going to want to make sure that you have adequate supervision in less structured activities across your school day. And oftentimes, the idea of a traffic flow map is especially important as you're designing your physical space in your room. Traffic flow maps help you as the educator and those other adults in the classroom really truly understand how to make your learning space most efficient and work for all learners. For example, if you have a student who at times gets in trouble, constantly poking peers as they walk by, you might have a traffic flow challenge on your hands. You might look at the physical arrangement of your classroom and identify ways from which that student might find themselves in less problematic situations across their school day by either moving the location physically of their chair, by changing the proximity you have to that student across lessons, or by identifying what particular challenges that student has with other peers that they're sitting near. What we'd like for you to do now is turn to your activity workbook for activity 3.1, which is the stop and jot activity. Here we're going to be focusing on designing your physical space in your classroom. So, please look to plan your classroom environment. First, design your physical space to facilitate your daily activities. Think through your daily routines and identify how your physical space might be arranged. Then consider visual access to all students at all times. How will you actively supervise your students across activities and routines of your day? Also consider non-academic daily routines and needs, such as when and how can students sharpen their pencils if needed. Do they have access to necessary materials, bathroom breaks, etc.? Welcome back. This is a quick review slide to debrief on activity 3.1. When you were looking to arrange your physical environment in your classroom, did you consider ways to minimize crowding and distraction across all routines and activities of your school day? Did you look to identify ways to facilitate active supervision on the part of yourself as the primary educator in that classroom and other adults who may be in and out of the classroom throughout the school day? Remember, key small changes to the physical environment can have a huge impact on your students' behavior. At this point, we're going to revisit our leading question of are the foundations of effective positive classroom behavior supports in place? Up to this point in this module, we've looked at the physical arrangement of your learning environment, which is this first box. We're now going to look at the second part of this area, which is looking at the routines you have across your school day and how do we establish those routines. So let me get out of your way here. As we start discussing routines across your school day and your school week, we start to look at what that looks like in context. At the elementary level, this might look like establishing explicit routines and procedures for activities such as arrival and dismissal at the beginning and end of the school day, as well as transitions between activities. You also want to think about how students are able to access help during lessons and what to do after work is completed. This is certainly not an exhaustive list, but certainly a list of example routines you might want to think through defining for your students at the very start of the school year. At the secondary level, very similar concepts, but if you're a high school teacher, how do you consider the routines and procedures that you'll be working through each day? Do students clearly understand how to turn in work? Do students understand how to access materials across lessons or make up missed work if they happen to be absent a particular day? Do students know how to transition efficiently and effectively and minimize interruptions in your lesson across days? These routines and more should be considered as you're developing your structures of your physical environment and your classroom. Some non-examples of what routines might look like is coming to the school year assuming that your students, elementary level or high school level, automatically know the routines in your classroom and understand the procedures without the instruction and feedback from you. This is the area that we would like to avoid, and by working through this module, we're hoping that you'll be able to develop some explicit routines and schedule them at the beginning of your school year and then revisit them throughout your school year to help identify expectations, identify routines, and then overtly teach those social skills and those expectations through routines to your students consistently across the year. So the next question becomes, how do you develop predictable routines? Some ideas behind how to develop predictable routines within your schedule. You should first be able to parse these out between teacher-based routines and student-based routines. When we're looking at teacher-based routines, we're looking at, have you, as the educator, identified administration time? Time where you're going to be able to plan for your lessons, schedule time with students, grade papers and assignments. You have personal time as well. Again, time to collaborate with colleagues, time to plan for upcoming unit tests or other events that are going to be occurring across your school year. If you have teacher routines, you can then start also looking at student routines. Across your typical school day, from Monday through Friday, have you clearly identified student-directed activities, whole group activities, independent activities, small group activities, and other types of student-based routines that you're going to want to have clear understandings and expectations around? So you're going to want to think through which type of routines you currently have and which ones would you like to continue to develop and expand in your current classroom environment. The big idea behind this notion of establishing class-wide routines is to make routines smooth and to allow transitions to be rapid between different activities of your school day. You want to be able to teach and then follow up with some practice around these transition activities and the varied routines that you'll be establishing for your students. Takeaway message here is the earlier you can establish clear expectations in your classroom, teach those expectations, and reinforce what those expectations look like across different routines of your school day and week, the better you'll be served across your school year. At this point, we'll ask you to look back into your activity workbooks for Activity 3.2. This one's a discussion board. Here we're going to be focusing on you developing your classroom routines. First, please review the linked examples provided. Upon your review of those examples, look to review and share your classroom routines with your colleagues. What routines do you currently have established in your own classroom? What routines would you like to establish in your own classroom? Welcome back for Activity 3.2 review. We hope you would now have many different examples of classroom routines from your colleagues. These are routines that perhaps you already have in your classroom, or perhaps some new routines that you may look to incorporate into your daily schedules. As you consider identifying new routines to establish in your classroom, remember to include routines for access to online resources for both students and families. More and more common each day in our classrooms, we provide access to online resources for families, and we want to make sure that all families and students know how to access these great resources from home.